Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to A Date with the Pollinators. My name's Jamie. I'm here with my coworker Alexa, and we're with the Gorge Waterway Action Society Youth Community Partnership Program. And we're here today to tell you all about pollinators, and especially the new pollinator meadow that we've got up in the Esquimalt Gorge Park. But always as first, so the Esquimalt Gorge Park has had a vastly changing and diverse history through time. The park's part of the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. They, along with other First Nations groups, such as the Sooke and Wasanich First Nations, have historical and current relationships with the land that continue to this day. We've provided a link in your info packet if you want to learn more about the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, their history, culture, and the important work that they do today. And before we get too far, we also want to thank the Gorge Waterway Action Society and the Youth Community Partnership Program for giving us the opportunity to add upon the already robust outreach of the Nature House, as well as Ashley Nielsen, Steph Gurney, and Caitlin Bergman for their hard work in making the pollinator meadow a reality, as well as the Township of Esquimalt for their assistance and support. If you don't know about the Gorge Waterway Action Society, they're a nonprofit group dedicated to the preservation and restoration of the Esquimalt Gorge Park. They're one of the organizations included in the entirety of the Gorge Waterway Initiative. But after decades of damage by industrial, urban, and recreational activities, the GWAS, which is the short form of Gorge Waterway Action Society, was founded to restore and preserve the EGP, shortened version of the Esquimalt Gorge Park, as well as run a multitude of educational programs through the Nature House. One of the main projects of the GWAS has been the daylighting of the Gorge Creek project. So it used to be culverted, and then in 2005, the project began to return the creek to a more natural watershed drainage point, both to improve the water quality and increase biodiversity in the area. And since then, the GWAS has been diligently monitoring both this project, as well as coming up with new ones to improve the Esquimalt Gorge Park for everybody. And Alexa and I are participants in the Youth Community Partnership Program, which is a new program funded by the federal government to support the GWAS, as well as allow young professionals such as ourselves to develop skills in the field of restoration, biology, and outreach under the supervision of skilled professionals. We're gonna head down to the meadow. In the summer of 2020, you might have noticed this new addition to the park. Just adjacent to the Gorge Creek, there's a big long stretch of fenced off woodchip, and that's our new pollinator meadow site, as you can see in this short video here. Spearheaded by the summer restoration technician, Ashley Nielsen, under the guidance of the restoration coordinator, Stephanie Gurney, they got this project up and running in a very short amount of time. The GWAS has been lucky to hire a bunch of summer students every year, thanks to funding from the Canada Summer Jobs Program, which leads to lots of new and exciting ideas coming in every summer. So to start, we're going to go into a little bit of background about the relationship between plants and their pollinators. So one of the goals for this meadow is to bring in native pollinators because we have non-native pollinators and they're useful, but they can't pollinate necessarily all of our native species. So each plant comes with its own attractants and requirements of its pollinators. Most pollinators and their plants have some level of coevolution, meaning they evolved in a way that they altered their physiologies to better support one another, ending up in a relationship called a symbiotic relationship where they're both benefiting. And so the pollinators, they get pollen, sometimes nectar, from the plants that they're heading out to. So pollen's super nutritionally dense for insects. It provides protein, fats, carbohydrate, and vitamins and minerals, and just really good dietary staple for the pollinators. But what are the plants getting out of the relationship? So they get pollinated. When a bug crawls on a plant to drink its nectar and collect pollen and everything, they get covered in it and they get these little grains of pollen all over themselves. And then they bring this pollen to the next plant that they visit. Pollen is one of the two forms of the gamete of the flower, meaning the reproductive cells. So once they get to the next plant that they're having a snack with, the pollen gets brushed off and it'll meet up with the ovule of the next plant and provide it with the genetically diverse pollen, so that the offspring is going to be more robust and genetically diverse. Some plants can self-pollinate, some can't. And even if they can self-pollinate, it doesn't mean it's necessarily the best evolutionary strategy, because without the genetic diversity of the sexual reproduction, populations can become vulnerable to collapse if they don't have that genetic diversity in the population to allow them to be adaptable to a changing environment, particularly important with the amount of climate change that we're seeing lately. So, you know, plants and pollinators, they've got this relationship, and plants have sacrificed in order to develop this close relationship. As you can see from this big, beautiful flower, they have to invest a lot of energy into the production of both the flowers, the bright colors, and all the pollen and nectar in order to attract the pollinators to them. But evolutionarily, they've decided that putting all this investment into getting pollinators is worth the cost. Some plants can be pollinated by wind, but it's not necessarily as reliable of a source because the probability of getting pollinated is lower. You know, you toss the pollen in the air and hope it meets your neighbor. But if you have a pollinator, the probability of getting pollinated is a lot higher because you know he's going to your neighbors and coming back to you and getting everybody involved in the process. But this high probability of pollination from the insect is only highly probable if the population and the activity remains constant. So, you know, the air pollinated plants, we always know there's going to be an air current, but the way that the world is changing and climate's changing and, you know, environments are being disrupted, we can't be as confident in the presence of these pollinators as much as we used to be able to. So these different investments yield different results. Just like different investments yield different pollinators, actually. So plants specify a little bit the way, which pollinator that they want to come visit them. And one of the ways that they do this is through color. So a plant can signal a specific pollinator by changing the color of its blooms. Insects have preferences for color when they go looking for their snacks. So the color that the plant blooms is one way a plant can preferentially determine who they want to come and pollinate them. There's more than one way though. Another way that plants can choose their pollinators by the shape of their blooms. So if you can see in this one, if a plant wants to attract a hawk moth with that big long tongue, they might develop a long tunnel through which the moth has to reach into in order to feed. Whereas a bee, however, doesn't have the right shape for a flower like this. So they're gonna have to look for a plant with, you know, the more open concept where they can easily access the pollen and the nectar. The shape of the flower is a big factor in determining whether or not it's going to be pollinated by, you know, bees, hawk moths, what type of pollinator is coming to visit. And yeah, normally we think about flowers and we think about butterflies and we think about bees, but there's other type of pollinators as well. So some plants actually smell like rotting meat and they produce heat in order to bring flies to them because their preferred pollinators are a fly. Another one might be open and close to the ground, allowing beetles to come in and be their pollinators. So it's another reason why having the native plants is important because they're going to attract the specific native pollinators. And this is going to help both the plant and the pollinator proliferate. Yeah, there's actually a type of orchid which has such a specific relationship with its wasp pollinator that the plant looks like a female wasp to trick male wasps to come and pollinate it. So we've got, yeah, bees and butterflies are important, but we've got a lot of different pollinators to look at. All right. So yeah, the pollinators get a ton of nutrition from the plants that they visit. But if this pollen's so nutritionally dense, as we've said, why do they need more than one source? So not all pollen has the same nutritional content. They all have the same basic components, but the relative composition of these components varies between the species, which is just another way that the plant-pollinator relationship is specified. The quality of the pollen can also help protect pollinators against pathogens as well as parasites. And you know, we like to plant these beautiful ornamental plants, but they don't often have the same quality or quantity of pollen as those of the native species. So, you know, they're beautiful to look at and the pollinators are gonna come and check them out, but they're not necessarily providing them with the nutrition they need. Most animals, including bugs, have some sort of self-medication, and a wide range in diet allows these insects to determine for themselves what they need in their diet in order to stay healthy. So if only one type of pollen is available, even if it is a high quality pollen, the pollinators are susceptible to nutritional deficits if that pollinator is not adapted to live off the only one plant source. So this brings us to another concept, the specialist versus the generalist. So some pollinators only pollinate a small number of very specific plants, whereas some pollinate a wide variety of plants. And it works the same for the plants themselves. So some plants are only attractive to a small number of pollinators and others to a super broad range. So lavender is one plant that almost every pollinator loves to visit. The native pollinators tend to be more specialists, and they stick to a diet of usually just a couple of their native species. One example of an extreme specialist relationship is the yucca plant. So yucca plants are only pollinated by the yucca moths here. This type of exclusive relationship is called an obligate mutualism. So the two organisms rely on each other exclusively for survival. When the female yucca moth enters the flower, she collects the pollen up into this sticky ball and transfers it to another flower where she lays her eggs in the ovary. And then on her way back out, she drops off this pollen ball, which fertilizes that flower. And then eventually her larvae will hatch, and they're going to consume a few of the yucca seeds on their emergence, but it's not enough to be of a significant detriment to the plant, but it is another example of the plant's investment in their pollinator. It's likely that these two organisms developed via coevolution. So as one of them changed in their evolutionary path, the other changed to follow suit. So maybe one moth developed a really good way to produce a lot of good offspring, and the yucca plants, which provided the best environment for them to do so, was pollinated more than their counterparts, resulting in that variation of the plant to also do better than their counterparts. And then they ended up having this very tight-knit relationship. We're gonna have a quick little break for a poll question by Alexa.
I'm gonna give Jamie a bit of a breather here. So some of you might be familiar with this movie, the Bee movie. It's famous for its happy ending, but there are some problems with the movie. You need a variety of different pollen sources in order to create a really robust and diverse community. So in this movie, they're only using the one type of pollen to pollinate a wide variety of species, which in reality would not work. One thing the movie does do right is it shows the collapse of several plant species when pollinators stop working, essentially. So it's just kind of a cool metaphor for, explaining some of these concepts on a simple scale.
Thank you, Alexa. It's very fun. Fun little break. Okay, so as we've chatted about, our native pollinators can be a little bit more specific about their meals than, our common honeybee. So in order to stock the park full of busy native pollinators, they needed to cater to those specific tastes. So in order to create a natural landscape of native plants, phase one of the Pollinator Meadow project had two main goals. One is to remove the existing grass cover, including the roots, and two was to plant shrubs as a perimeter and clusters of native plants throughout the site. But before you want to begin actively altering the site, you want to collect a bunch of baseline data of the plant and insect diversity in the area to determine whether or not the implementation is going to have any effect on the diversity of the pollinators, as well as the invasive species in the area. So they collected baseline data. As you can see here, this was a bit of their methodology. They had some transects, and off these transects, they had 1 meter squared quadrats that they would look at to determine how many pollinators, what type of pollinators, what type of plants, and how many plants were in this area, to determine what changes were going to happen after this plan was implemented. So once they had all this baseline data, the township of Esquimalt came in, mowed the area to remove the bulk of the grass and the invasive species. And then they tilled the area a few times below the grassroot layer to disrupt the seed banks in the soil, which would make the maintenance of the site difficult if the grasses were continually trying to come back up. And then after that, the native species were planted, as well as the shrub boundary planted along the back side of the fence line, closer to the gravel path. Beyond just introducing plant species to the meadow, they also added some natural textures. There's like some boulders, a bit of a scrape with some pebbles lining it, and a bunch of woody debris added to the site to provide shelter and water for the soon-to-be inhabitants. By creating that small depression in the site, water can accumulate and make a little bit of a muddy area for pollinators to come and hydrate. In particular, butterflies like mud, an activity called mud puddling, where the butterflies congregate around a moist area and hang out and take a drink. So this is all good to create a more natural habitat for these pollinators. The shrubs chosen during phase 1 were chosen based on their aggressive growth and suitability to the site. So it's like an open, often hot and dry climate in this area, specifically for this meadow. So the plants had to be plants that would be successful under these conditions. They also wanted plants with aggressive growth patterns so that they had a chance to outcompete the invasives, which were obviously going to try and reclaim the space that we've just removed them from. Another long-term goal for the project was to have a meadow with a long bloom time, meaning that there's a broad spread of blooming times for the plants in the meadow so that the local pollinators are going to have forage for as long as possible through the year. The meadow right now is pretty dormant. It's pretty cold out. But if you take a look around the edges on a warmer day, you're going to see lots of little wild strawberry plants coming up. And we also just recently got some interpretive signage installed, as you can see here. The sign's going to allow passersby to learn a little bit about the importance of pollinators, native versus introduced pollinators, and ornamental versus native species. So here's a little bit of a picture of the meadow. And yeah, once you put a plan into motion, you have to usually adjust for the unexpecteds. So in the case of this meadow, they initially didn't want to lay down this chip in the surface because it makes the soil just a little bit acidic and a little bit harder for plants to grow. But the remaining seed banks of the grasses in the soil required it for the suppression of the regrowth. And then this fence that wasn't necessarily in the plan, but the deer in the park are always good at finding snacks, and they were sampling a little bit too much, so that fence had to go up as well. And what's next? So phase 2 is hopefully going to expand the meadow to include a bit of the Gary Oak meadow that's just adjacent. It's going to include a lot of planting of more plants in the main meadow, depending on which were successful and which weren't during the first couple of years of the meadow being in place. We're also going to have a better idea of how the invasive plants in the area are being managed and coming up with new ideas for the maintenance of invasive removals. Steph and her crew from the YCP are going to be looking at the success of different areas of the meadow, specifically how the edge of the meadow compares to the inside, whether the placement of plants in the meadow are altering their successes, or whether certain species are more successful in different areas of the meadow. Another project that's hopefully in the works is creating a leaf litter compost to test as a more natural and sustainable method of grass suppression, which will also allow for more nutrient cycling if placed around the edges of the growing plants to make sure that the soil in the meadow is rich and helping them all grow. So, as we said, monitoring is an important part of a project like this. And this is kind of the collection of insects from the first pollinator survey. So you can see we had a bunch of butterflies there. We've got a clear wing moth. Here we've got a bunch of bees and wasps. And then we move down into some more flies. And yeah, like I said, flies are pollinators too, even if we're not thinking about them all the time. But yeah, so as we continue to do these pollinator surveys, this collection is going to grow. And visitors to the Nature House are going to be able to see through the years how the species diversity and number of species is changing through the years based on how well this meadow is doing. So one of the biggest challenges for a site like this is maintaining the invasive removal. Seed spread's a huge issue. It's amazing that we've been able to remove so many invasives from the meadow, but there's plants outside the area which are going to want to move back into this prime real estate. One consideration is, that edge boundary was put in to help limit the amount of seed spread back into the meadow. But another is removing the seed heads of the invasive species around the site prior to spreading. So one invasive in particular is this Canadian thistle, an invasive species despite its name. And if you can remove the seed heads of those before they seed, it's super important because each of their seed heads can produce between 1,000 and 1,500 seeds per flower. So they're very good at what they do. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the Gorge Creek restoration through the park was a huge undertaking, had a big effect on the park. One of the main goals of this project was to return it to a more natural landscape. But, with a project that large, there's unexpected side effects, one of which that affects this pollinator meadow is the aggressive grasses that are in there. So much of the soil in the area is a non-natural fill that was moved during the Gorge Creek project. And in order to stabilize that soil, they applied a hydroseed blend, which is full of aggressive and fast growing non-native grasses, which quickly rooted and stabilized the topsoil. And they did exactly what they were supposed to do. But now that we're trying to refine a bit of the natural systems in the park, they're no longer necessarily what we're looking for. And they're becoming a bit of a difficulty in managing this new project. So I just think it's interesting that, the same organism that was used was once a perfect solution, and now it's become a difficult problem. So things can change through time, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So yeah, the GWAS has accomplished so much so quickly, but now it's up to us and volunteers to make sure that the project continues. The invasives are always going to be trying to make their way back into the site to choke out the native species. It's just an inevitability of working in an urban area. We've altered the landscape around us so much that we've created these spaces and these pockets so our native plants can't thrive the way they had without our influence. But as environmental stewards, it's our job to mitigate and reduce our impact on these sensitive ecosystems. So it's up to us to help it keep going. And one big contributor to this project was the Greater Victoria Green Team. It's a local group based on the site Meetup, and they get together regularly to participate in invasive removal events. People who participate come from all sorts of backgrounds. Some are, biologists, gardeners, people who just like to be outside. The team came through and helped us clear up the meadow, as well as helping plant some of the species in the park. And without groups like this and other volunteers, we didn't have the manpower to complete a lot of big projects like this. So we're super thankful for all the volunteers, whether they come through the Green Team or elsewhere. And if you're interested, they are likely holding another invasive removal event around the beginning of March. And yeah, things are a little bit different during this COVID-19 pandemic. So most events are split into 2 sessions, which limit the number of people on site to maintain proper social distancing. And you're also encouraged to bring your own equipment. But if you think you might have an interest in it, keep an eye on the Green Team Meetup page. So yeah, having a garden, it's already just a great first step in helping pollinators. If you can, add native plants and natural textures like the boulders and old woody material to your garden. It's a great way to make space for the native pollinators. And just having that shelter and water for them as well. But as you can see in this picture, we've got that little bit of drainage through the meadow, and that's where the water collects to make the mud for the butterflies. But we don't all have the space to be doing that. So I found this really cool project. If you want to make your own mud hole for butterflies, just a shallow dish with a bit of wet sand or mud and some rocks. The rocks make it so the little insects won't drown when they come for a drink. And if you add a little bit of compost or manure to the mud puddle, it'll help the butterflies get some more nutrients. But if you want to make your own little spot for butterflies in your backyard, this is a cute little way to do it. And then just to finish it off, I was wondering if you maybe know any of these pollinators and flower species. So we'll do a little bit of a quiz. So anybody know who this is? Hoverfly. Okay. So we got a hoverfly on Queen Anne's. What about this one? Entire leaf gumweed. You got it. What about this little guy? Leaf cutter bee. Yeah, so those are like its larvae. They pack a little bit of pollen and their larvae in there, and then they bury them somewhere. And the last one. Anybody know this? So I want to thank everybody for coming out. Make sure to check out your informational packet to find more information. We've got a guide for some native plants to add to your garden and some things you can do to help native pollinators in your area. If you want to consider becoming a GWAS member, donations and memberships all go through the website at gorge.ca. You can follow us on Facebook at our Gorge Waterway Nature House and our new Instagram account, Gorge Waterway Nature House. And then, yeah, if you want to follow up, send any emails, questions, ideas, photos of your own pollinator meadows to thegorgewaterway@gmail.com. And we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you so much for participating.
Hey everyone, have a great night.